So up to this point, we've taken a look at what was going on in northeast Wisconsin prior to contact, and we've also looked at colonization just with regard to the Spanish and English, albeit very briefly. Now we combine these two things together. We look at contact specifically in northeast Wisconsin, in our neck of the woods. And we're going to have a very French focus, so we'll take a look at this man named Samuel de Champlain. We were part of what was called New France, and Champlain is pretty much the individual who originates this concept. He's a soldier and a sailor who made almost 30 transatlantic voyages. This means he crossed the Atlantic almost 30 times, never lost a single individual on any voyage. Now, he sought to establish friendly relations with indigenous tribes because he knew that their knowledge was necessary to take advantage of the lucrative fur trade. Lucrative meaning we can make a lot of money on this. However, he went one step further in envisioning a society where Europeans and indigenous individuals would trade together, they'd marry each other, and live peacefully side by side. Now, to accomplish this goal, he hired eager young men whose job was to live among and become immersed in native life and culture. Now, these individuals were known as trunchmen, or interpreters that, they became fluent in the language of wherever they were living, and they established positive relations. Now, some lived for a short period of time, and then they returned to French settlements, while some stayed longer and even married indigenous women. The one we care about the most is Jean Nicolet, and he was about 20 years old when he went to New France at the specific request of Champlain. Now, he learned Algonquin languages and culture, and he lived with the Nipissing for about 8 to 9 years, and he even fathered a daughter with a Nipissing woman. Because now this is a guy who obviously is going to live in the culture for an extended period. He also lived with the Huron for about 3 years, and he learned their language and culture. And he was even involved with the Haudenosaunee of what's now upstate New York in diplomatic negotiations. So in the 1630s, specifically, 1634, Nicolet traveled with several Huron and sailed from what's now Lake Huron to Lake Michigan. And the story goes that he made landfall at modern-day Green Bay, where he was greeted by about 5,000 Puan warriors. Now, his official mission was to meet what were called the People of the Sea, called the Puans by the Algonquin, and he arranged a peace treaty between the Huron and Puan, in addition to a treaty with the French. Now, several accepted elements of his journey have more recently been called into question. He most likely made landfall near that grand village of the Menominee. Not necessarily what we call Green Bay, the city, but probably more near Marinette, since we know that they were the mediators between the Puan and, the French and the Hurons. This is the most famous image of Nicolet's landing. It's prominently displayed in the Brown County Courthouse. Ultimately, they would not have made landfall where they could see people, because they didn't know how these negotiations were going to go, and they didn't want their canoes and potentially their method of evacuation to get damaged. Now, you see him in a Chinese cape, and records indicate he wore what was called a China damask robe. Over the years, it's been interpreted as a silk robe, but more likely, this was a cape. He probably was wearing a cape, which was very common for French aristocrats. So this image, over 100 years old, probably not the most accurate. This one, a little bit better and a bit more recent. It does place more of the emphasis on his Huron companions, but both of them show him in these silk robes because the story that was passed down was that he thought he had reached China. That was never part of his mission. He did not believe he had actually reached East Asia. That was just kind of what had been passed down through the generations. But nevertheless, Nicolet's voyage started to solidify the French presence in the area. Now, in terms of what the French brought with them, we have Christian missionaries. Missionaries being individuals who travel to a place and they bring their faith with them. Their goal is to spread the faith. Father Jacques Marquette is going to make his voyage with his traveling companion, Joliet, because the Six Nations War with the Huron will eliminate a reliable supply of furs. So French traders are going to look to the actual Great Lakes tribes for assistance. Now you get an idea of his voyage by looking at the map. His goal is to map the region to set up trading posts, and Marquette was proficient at learning languages such as Huron, and this is kind of a trend that we see throughout the centuries. Now you can see that he travels the entire length of the Fox River until it meets the Wisconsin. Then he travels the Wisconsin until it runs into the Mississippi River, the highway of North America. He goes south on the Mississippi, but you can see that he turns back when the Mississippi reaches the Arkansas River. This was because he saw individuals on the banks of the Mississippi with European goods, European trinkets. This led him to believe that if the Spanish weren't there, they had been there and might come back, so he turned back because he didn't want to spark an incident. So we have Father Marquette. Now, Father Claude Alloway will serve, among other things, as a missionary to the Potawatomi, and he will proclaim the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River Valley to be under the control of the King of France. He even founded his mission at a site known as Rapid des Pierres. This is the last set of rapids on the Fox River, which flows north, last set of rapids before entering the Bay of Green Bay. And today we simply call the city De Pere. His written records really give an excellent account of the Catholic Church's influence in the Midwest in the 1600s, an influence that's still very much felt to this day. Now, in terms of the fur trade, keep in mind that often it's about the money. If each side has something the other wants, both sides are going to be happy if they feel like they get a fair deal. Now, the French gained pretty much a monopoly on the fur trade because they were kind of the only ones in the region, but it was an unequal trade when you zoom out and take a look at it. So the French provided gifts to their indigenous trading partners in the fall, which meant that their trading partners were indebted to them to get them an equal value of beaver pelts. When we say fur trade, we're talking beaver pelts. Well, beaver is highly sought after because it's waterproof and well insulated. So these hats predominantly, you're going to have gloves. They're going to be expensive into the 20th century. Now, the French colonization plan is ultimately going to be economic. So a minimum amount of settlers are going to need the cooperation of these powerful tribes for protection. And these indigenous tribes, they recognized this pretty quick as well, so they used it to try and get better deals for themselves. We also see that the population will decrease. Now, the Ho-Chunk population dropped to about 500. 500 by the late 1600s. And this is about going down from its original 8 to 20,000 when Nicolay first arrived. Now, in Ho-Chunk accounts of the disease that afflicted their populace, a lot of them turned yellow as a symptom, so this isn't necessarily consistent with smallpox, which is kind of a traditional spreader from Europeans to indigenous tribes. So in this case, the disease spread was unintentional. We also know that tribes and nations were continually at war with one another. And as we kind of saw on one of our previous maps, the state of Wisconsin got a huge influx of refugees when you had the Haudenosaunee, who were armed by the British and the Dutch, pushing out Algonquin-speaking tribes backed by the French. And this is going to place a huge strain on the Menominee and Ho-Chunk. And this is going to be something that the French missionaries and explorers, they're not quite going to grasp this, and it's only until recently that this has been understood.